Only those who knew him or his family well were allowed inside the Presley mansion today. The private funeral service reportedly drew many celebrities, but they all drove quietly through the gates.
At 86 years old, Elvis's longtime nurse is crying uncontrollably as she finally decides to speak about something Elvis begged her to keep quiet. She says she carried this heavy truth for many years. What secret has she held in her heart? And why is this the moment she chooses to reveal it? Join us as we explore everything. One woman's 40-year promise to a legend. Marion Fletcher had always been the kind of woman who noticed things others missed. Throughout her 30-year nursing career, she had developed a gentle attentiveness that made patients feel seen, understood, and cared for in their most vulnerable moments. Her soft-spoken manner and warm brown eyes had comforted countless souls through pain, fear, and the approaching shadow of death. She never gossiped about her patients, never shared their private confessions, never broke the sacred trust between healer and wounded. Even after retirement, even as her own body began to betray her with arthritis and fading strength, Marion remained what she had always been: a keeper of secrets, a guardian of dignity, a woman whose word meant everything. But at 86 years old, sitting in the cluttered bedroom of her small Nashville home, Marion felt the weight of one particular secret crushing her chest with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The room around her told the story of a life carefully compartmentalized. On one wall hung cheerful photographs of her children and grandchildren, their smiling faces frozen in moments of ordinary joy: birthdays, graduations, family barbecues. But the other side of the room remained bare, almost deliberately empty, as though she had spent decades creating a physical boundary between what she could share and what she could not. In the back of her closet, behind winter coats she no longer wore, sat a cardboard box she had not opened in 15 years. Inside that box were letters written in a familiar, slightly slanted handwriting. Beside those letters lay photographs she had never shown another living soul. And beneath everything else rested a leather journal whose pages contained words that could shatter carefully constructed histories and change how the world remembered a man who had been gone for more than 40 years. Marion did not look at that box often anymore. Looking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and feeling had become too dangerous as the years passed. But lately, something had shifted inside her. Perhaps it was the increasing frequency with which she woke at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, certain she heard his voice calling her name. Perhaps it was the way her hands now trembled so badly she could barely hold a coffee cup, reminding her that time was running out faster than she had anticipated. Or perhaps it was simply that carrying silence for so long had become heavier than whatever consequences the truth might bring. "Marion, I trust you completely," he had said to her that August afternoon in 1977. His words slightly slurred, but his eyes still sharp with determination. "You're the only one who knows the whole truth. Promise me you'll keep it until the time is right." She had promised. Of course she had promised. She would have done anything for him in those final desperate days when everything had been falling apart, and he had wanted someone, anyone, who could help him find a way out of the unbearable pressure of his own fame. But when was the right time? He had never specified. He had never given her instructions for how she would know when that moment arrived. And so Marion had chosen silence year after year, watching from a distance as biographies were published, documentaries were made, conspiracy theories flourished, and his legend grew larger while the complicated, vulnerable, achingly human man she had known disappeared beneath layers of mythology. Now, surrounded by the accumulated debris of her own long life, Marion felt the moment had finally come. Not because she wanted attention or recognition, not because she sought to profit from what she knew, but because she was dying. Perhaps not tomorrow or next month, but soon enough that she could feel death's patient presence in the room with her, waiting politely for its turn, and she could not take this particular secret to her grave. It would not be right. It would not be fair to him, to his memory, to the truth itself. Her daughter had visited yesterday, cheerfully oblivious to the storm brewing inside Marion's chest. "You seem distracted, Mama," she had said, squeezing Marion's gnarled hand. "Everything okay?" Marion had smiled and nodded, the way she always did, protecting her child from knowledge she could not yet share. But after her daughter left, Marion had made a decision. She would tell the story, all of it, every impossible, unbelievable detail. Let the world decide what to believe. Now, in the fading afternoon light, Marion rose slowly from her bed, slowly from her joints protesting with each movement, and shuffled toward the closet. Her hands shook as she pushed aside the winter coats and pulled out the cardboard box. It felt lighter than she remembered, though she knew that was only her imagination playing tricks. She carried it to her bed and sat down, the box resting in her lap like a sleeping animal that might wake at any moment. For several minutes, she simply stared at it, her breath coming shallow and quick. Inside this box was proof, not of everything perhaps, but of enough. Enough to make people question what they thought they knew. Enough to turn his death from a tragic ending into something far stranger, far more complicated, far more human than any official account had ever acknowledged. "I'm sorry I waited so long," Marion whispered to the empty room. Though she was not sure whether she was apologizing to him or to herself, or to some abstract concept of truth that had been patient with her all these years. "But I'm ready now. I'm finally ready to tell them what really happened." She opened the box with trembling fingers, and the first thing she saw was his face looking back at her from a photograph no one else had ever seen. A photograph taken not in 1977, but years later, in a place no one would ever think to look. Marion's eyes filled with tears as she touched the photograph gently, the way you might touch something precious and breakable. She had kept her promise for so long. She had protected him, just as he had asked, but promises, she had finally realized, were not meant to outlive the people who mattered most. Outside her window, the Nashville evening began its slow descent into darkness. Inside her small bedroom, an 86-year-old woman prepared to speak words that would either be dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly mind or recognized as the most extraordinary revelation in decades. Either way, Marion Fletcher would finally be free. A nurse's memory of Elvis's hidden battle. Marion Fletcher offered quiet compassion and unwavering presence, becoming a refuge for souls who had nowhere else to turn. But nothing in her extensive career had prepared Marion for the complexity of caring for Elvis Presley in those final, agonizing months of 1977. The world saw a legend, a man whose voice had changed music forever, whose charisma had captivated generations, whose very name conjured images of screaming fans and sold-out stadiums. They saw the jumpsuits, the performances, the mansion called Graceland that stood like a monument to American dreams come true. What they never saw were the private moments Marion witnessed daily, moments that revealed a truth so different from the public image that it sometimes felt like she was caring for two completely separate people. The real Elvis, the one who existed behind closed doors in the quiet hours of night, was not the confident king the world imagined. He was a man drowning in expectations he could never quite meet, suffocating under the weight of a persona that had grown too large for any single human being to sustain. Marion had seen this pattern before in other patients, the way fame could become a prison, how adoration from millions could somehow magnify rather than ease a person's loneliness. But with Elvis, the contradiction felt especially cruel. Here was someone who had everything the world said should bring happiness, yet his eyes carried a sadness so profound it made Marion's heart ache every time she looked at him. Their first real conversation had happened near midnight, about 3 weeks after Marion had been hired. She had found him sitting alone in the music room at Graceland, staring at a guitar he was not playing. The house was filled with people as always, friends, employees, hangers-on. But somehow Elvis managed to be completely alone even in a crowd. "Can't sleep again?" Marion had asked gently, settling into a chair near him but not too close, respecting the invisible boundary that suffering people often wanted. Elvis had looked up at her with those famous eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades despite his relative youth. "Sleep and I don't get along much anymore," he had said, his voice soft and Memphis thick, too many thoughts running circles in my head. That night had opened a door between them. Over the following months, Marion became something Elvis desperately wanted but rarely found, someone who saw him as simply human. Their late-night conversations had nothing to do with his career, his legacy, or the mythology that surrounded him. Instead, they talked about fears that kept him awake, regrets that haunted him, and a longing for peace that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. "People think I have everything," Elvis told her one evening, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the water glass Marion offered. "They see Graceland and the cars and the money, and they think that's happiness. But Marion, I swear to you, sometimes I feel like I'm being crushed under the weight of being Elvis Presley. Does that make any sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Marion had replied, her voice steady and sure. "Being worshipped is not the same as being loved. Being famous is not the same as being known." Elvis had looked at her with such gratitude that Marion had felt tears prick her eyes. "Exactly," he had whispered. "God, exactly." The burden he carried was invisible to most, but devastatingly real. Elvis was not just a performer. He had become an industry, an empire, a phenomenon that employed dozens of people and supported countless families. Every decision he made rippled outward, affecting lives beyond his own. He could not simply quit, could not walk away, could not admit weakness or exhaustion because too many people depended on him to remain exactly what they wanted him to be. "Sometimes I dream about being somebody else," he confessed during one particularly difficult night when pain and exhaustion had stripped away his usual careful control. "Just a regular man with a regular job, coming home to a quiet house where nobody wants anything from me except to be there. Is that crazy?" "It's human," Marion had assured him. "It's completely, perfectly human." But humanity was precisely what Elvis's life circumstances seemed determined to deny him. The concerts continued despite his declining health. The demands multiplied even as his energy diminished. The pressure to remain forever young, forever charismatic, forever extraordinary crushed him a little more each day. Marion watched helplessly as the contradiction ate away at him. The world's insistence that he be superhuman, colliding with his increasingly desperate need to simply be a man, flawed and tired and struggling like anyone else. The medications worried Marion terribly. She understood why doctors prescribed them. The chronic pain was real, the insomnia was debilitating, the anxiety was crippling. But she also recognized the dangerous spiral forming. Elvis wanted relief from suffering, but the relief itself was becoming another kind of prison. She tried to talk to him about it, tried to suggest alternatives, but the machinery around Elvis was too powerful, too invested in keeping him functional at any cost. Then came the night that changed everything between them. It was early July, about 6 weeks before the end. Elvis had called Marion to his bedroom around 2 in the morning, and when she entered, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, tears streaming down his face. "I need to tell you something," he had said, his voice breaking with emotion. "And I need you to promise me on everything you hold sacred, that you'll never repeat it, not while I'm alive, maybe not ever." Marion had sat beside him, taking his trembling hand in hers. "You can trust me, Elvis. Whatever you need to say, it stays between us." What he told her in that dark bedroom, in whispered words punctuated by tears and desperate hope, was something Marion had never imagined. It was not a confession of wrongdoing or scandal. It was something far more unexpected, far more impossible, far more heartbreakingly human than any tabloid speculation. "I'm so tired, Marion," he had said, his grip on her hand almost painfully tight. "I'm so tired of being him. I just want peace. I just want to breathe without the whole world watching. Do you understand?" "I understand," Marion had whispered back, though her heart was racing with the implications of what he was revealing. "Promise me," Elvis had pleaded, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "Promise me you'll never tell what I'm planning. Promise me you'll let me have this one thing that's mine alone." Marion had made that promise with tears in her own eyes, knowing she was agreeing to carry a burden that would press down on her soul for decades. But looking at this exhausted, trapped, suffocating man who had given so much to so many, she could not refuse him the one thing he begged for. "I promise," she had said. "I'll keep your secret, Elvis. I swear it." He had hugged her then, clinging to her like a drowning man to driftwood, and Marion had felt the full weight of what she was agreeing to settle onto her shoulders. She was binding herself to silence about something that would change everything if it ever came to light. 6 weeks later, the world learned that Elvis Presley had passed away. Marion stood in her small apartment listening to the news reports, feeling the secret burn inside her chest like hot coal. She had kept her promise then. She had kept it for 40 years. But now, with her own death approaching, Marion wondered if the time had finally come to reveal what Elvis had truly wanted, what he had planned, what he had begged her to hide, what the world had never known about the final chapter of the king's life. The truth was waiting, patient as ever, for Marion to finally set it free. The night that shattered everything. On the night of August 16, 1977, Marion's instincts screamed at her with an intensity that made her physically ill, and despite everything she knew, despite all her experience and training, she could not stop what was about to unfold. The day had felt wrong from the very beginning. Marion had arrived at Graceland that afternoon to find an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. The air felt heavy and strange, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible weight. Elvis had been unusually quiet during their brief interaction earlier, his eyes distant and sad in a way that frightened Marion more than his usual exhaustion. There was something final in his demeanor, something that made her want to grab his hand and beg him to talk to her, to tell her what was happening inside his mind. "Are you all right?" she had asked him, studying his face with the practiced attention she gave all her patients. Elvis had smiled at her, but the smile never reached his eyes. "I'm just tired, Marion. So very tired." Those words had haunted Marion for the rest of the day. She had heard patients say they were tired countless times before, but this felt different. This was not the tiredness of someone who wanted sleep. This was the exhaustion of a soul that had carried too much for too long, the weariness of someone who had finally reached the absolute limit of their endurance. As evening descended on Graceland, Marion's sense of unease intensified. She found herself checking on Elvis more frequently than necessary, inventing reasons to walk past his room, listening for sounds that might indicate distress. The other staff members went about their usual routines, seemingly unaware that anything was amiss. But Marion could feel disaster approaching like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable. Around 9 o'clock that night, Marion saw Elvis one final time. He was heading upstairs, moving slowly, his body language radiating exhaustion, and something else Marion could not quite name. Their eyes met across the hallway, and in that brief moment, Marion saw something that would torture her for the rest of her life. His expression was gentle despite the weariness, almost peaceful in a way she had not seen in months. But beneath that peace was a sadness so profound it seemed to swallow all the light around him. "Good night, Marion," he had said softly, and his voice carried a weight that made her heart clench. "Good night," she had whispered back, fighting the urge to run to him, to somehow keep him from walking up those stairs. But she had let him go. She had watched him disappear from view, and that decision, or perhaps it was not even a decision but simply the natural flow of a moment she had not understood, would haunt every day of her remaining life. Marion tried to sleep that night in her small room at Graceland, but rest would not come. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding in the silence. Several times she almost got up, almost went to check on Elvis one more time. But what would she say? What reason could she give for disturbing him in the middle of the night, beyond a feeling she could not name or explain? The scream that shattered the early afternoon stillness on August 16th was a sound Marion would hear in her nightmares for decades. It was followed by shouting, by running footsteps, by chaos erupting throughout Graceland like a bomb had detonated at its heart. Marion ran toward the commotion, her nurse's training taking over even as terror flooded her veins. She would never speak publicly about what she saw in those terrible minutes. The details belonged to Elvis, to his dignity, to the privacy he had so rarely been granted in life. But the emotional impact of that moment, the overwhelming wave of grief and horror and guilt that crashed over Marion as she realized what had happened, remained as vivid 40 years later as it had been in that first devastating instant. "No, no, no," Marion had whispered, her hands shaking violently as she tried to help, tried to do something, anything, to reverse what had already occurred. But even as she moved through the motions of her training, even as she desperately attempted interventions she knew were futile, Marion understood with terrible clarity that Elvis was gone. The guilt that seized her in that moment was crushing. Every instinct that had warned her something was wrong, every impulse she had ignored to check on him one more time, every conversation they had shared where she might have said something different, all of it crashed down on Marion with accusatory force. She had known. On some level, she had known something terrible was approaching, and she had not prevented it. "I should have stayed with him," Marion sobbed to one of the doctors who arrived, her professionalism completely shattered by grief. "I felt something was wrong. I knew and I didn't. There was nothing you could have done," the doctor had said, but his words felt hollow against the weight of Marion's guilt. In the days that followed, as Graceland transformed into a circus of grief and speculation, as reporters swarmed and fans wailed and the entire world seemed to descend on Memphis, Marion retreated into herself. She gave no interviews, made no statements, refused all requests to share her memories or experiences. The promise she had made to Elvis, the secret he had begged her to keep, suddenly felt like both a sacred obligation and an unbearable prison. She had agreed to silence about his plans, about what he had confided to her in that dark bedroom 6 weeks before his death. But now Elvis was gone, and Marion was left holding knowledge that burned inside her like acid. Should she speak? Would revealing what Elvis had told her help anyone, or would it only add to the speculation and conspiracy theories that were already beginning to swirl? In the end, Marion chose silence. She honored the promise she had made to a desperate, exhausted man who had trusted her with his deepest truth. But that silence came at a cost Marion had not anticipated. She left nursing shortly after Elvis's death, unable to continue in a profession that now felt tainted by her failure to save the one patient who had wanted her most. She withdrew from her social circles, avoiding questions about her time at Graceland, deflecting curiosity with polite but firm refusals to discuss her experience. The years passed and Marion built a quiet life in the shadows, deliberately unremarkable and carefully private. She married briefly, divorced quietly, raised her children with gentle love and fierce protection of their privacy. She never attended Elvis tributes or vigils, never visited Graceland again, never allowed herself to be pulled back into the mythology surrounding his death. But the guilt never faded. Every August 16th, Marion would wake with that same sick feeling in her stomach, remembering the warning signs she had sensed but not acted upon decisively enough. She replayed that final look in Elvis's eyes endlessly, wondering what he had been trying to tell her without words. Had he been saying goodbye? Had he been asking for help she had failed to provide? Or had that gentle, weary expression been something else entirely? Perhaps acceptance of a plan he had already set into motion. But even as she considered speaking, Marion's heart still carried that crushing guilt, still asked the same agonizing question it had been asking for 40 years. Could I have saved him? Should I have tried harder? Was his death my failure? Or was it something else entirely? Something I still don't fully understand. The Unburdening. Marion Fletcher never sought attention or praise, never wanted validation from others to know her own worth. Instead, she moved through life quietly, leaving gentleness in her wake like footprints in sand. But now, at 86, with her body failing and time running short, Marion carried something too heavy for one person to hold any longer. The truth sat in her chest like a stone, pressing against her heart with relentless weight. For 40 years, she had honored a promise made to a desperate man who had trusted her completely. But promises, Marion had finally realized, sometimes wanted to be released before they crushed the person carrying them. "I'm not doing this for attention," Marion said softly, her aged hands trembling as she held the photographs and letters that proved her story. "I'm not interested in scandal or headlines. I just can't leave this world without telling people what Elvis truly was. Not the legend, but the man." The secret she had carried was not what most people might imagine. There was no hidden conspiracy, no shocking revelation designed to destroy a carefully crafted image. Instead, Marion's secret was something far more profound and heartbreaking. It was about vulnerability, about the unbearable cost of fame, about a human being who had been worshipped by millions, yet understood by almost no one. "In those final weeks, Elvis told me things he could never say publicly," Marion explained, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "He talked about how exhausting it was to be everyone's dream but never just a man. He was drowning in expectations, suffocating under the weight of being Elvis Presley instead of just Elvis. And what he planned in those final days wasn't about escaping responsibility. It was about finding peace he thought was impossible otherwise." Marion paused, gathering strength to continue. "He made me promise I would never reveal what he was truly thinking, what he was truly feeling. He was afraid the world would misunderstand, would judge him for being human instead of superhuman. But I think he was wrong. I think the world wanted to know then, and definitely needs to know now, that Elvis Presley was a person, fragile, scared, exhausted, and desperately longing for something his fame would never allow him." The essence of Marion's revelation was not dramatic gossip, but painful truth. Elvis had not been living. He had been performing life, trapped in a role he could no longer sustain. The medications, the isolation, the strange hours, these were not signs of excess, but symptoms of a man trying desperately to cope with an existence that had become unbearable. "People thought he had everything," Marion continued, her voice breaking. "But what he actually had was a prison made of gold. Every smile was scheduled. Every moment was watched. Every breath belonged to someone else's expectations. And when he looked at me with those exhausted eyes and whispered that he just wanted to be free, I understood something terrible, that Elvis Presley had slowly executed the man underneath." Marion's decision to finally speak was not about betraying Elvis's trust, but about honoring the fullness of who he was. For decades, the world had debated his death, created conspiracies, reduced his final chapter to speculation and rumor. But Marion knew a different truth, one that revealed not scandal, but profound human struggle. "I want people to understand," she said through her tears, "that Elvis didn't fail us. We failed him. We loved the legend so much we forgot to see the person. We demanded superhuman strength from someone who was achingly, beautifully human. And if my speaking now helps even one person understand the cost of worship without compassion, then breaking my silence will have been worth it." As Marion finished her story, sitting exhausted but somehow lighter in her cluttered bedroom, she felt the burden finally lift from her chest. The stone she had carried for 40 years dissolved, leaving behind not emptiness but peace. She had honored Elvis by keeping his confidence while he wanted protection. And now she honored him again by revealing his humanity to a world that had forgotten he possessed it. The truth was finally free, gentle and profound, and deeply human. But one question remained, hanging in the quiet air of Marion's room. Now that the world finally knows Elvis Presley was a man who struggled and suffered and longed for peace he could never find, what will we do with that knowledge? Will we learn to see our heroes as humans, deserving of compassion, Or will we continue crushing them beneath the weight of our expectations? Marion had spoken. The rest was up to us.